Hi, young adults. We are going to talk about Module 60 for intelligence. Um, so, hopefully, you have the handout that I gave you in class as a chart, and we're going to go through some of the summaries of the different theories, the strengths, and the other considerations. Those are kind of your three columns on your chart. So, the things that we're going to focus on in this hopefully short video is what is intelligence. Number two, we'll go over the different theories of intelligence. And the third thing that you don't have a handout for that I want to talk about is the idea of what is emotional intelligence. So those are the three things we're going to talk about. So in terms of the question, what is intelligence, you really have to think about how should you define intelligence. And the great debate in terms of the different theorists that we're going to talk about is intelligence one thing? Is it many things? Like, how exactly would you measure intelligence? Experts would agree, like, and we're talking about it, intelligence expert would agree on this one thing, is that intelligence is a concept and not necessarily a thing. And what do we mean by concept, right? Generally speaking, intelligence is operationally defined as whatever an intelligence tests measure. So what is the point of the test? For most of you, your entire life in school, intelligence tests have been school smarts. But are there other types of intelligence outside of being school smarts? Right? So outside of your math, English, history, science, like what is intelligence? Are those the only things in intelligence? Would you consider common sense is part of your intelligence? Because I've met some really intelligent people who are very book smart, but don't really know what's happening socially or emotionally with the people who are around them, right? So, what does intelligence look like? Your book gives you the definition. Intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, to solve a problem, and to use knowledge in order to adapt to a new situation, right? So, those are the three different parts of intelligence: learning from experience, solving a problem, and then using your knowledge that you have to adapt to a new situation. Okay. And then an intelligence test is a method for assessing an individual's mental aptitude and comparing them with those of others. Typically, you use some type of numerical score on an intelligence test. Okay. So now we're going to move to your handout that has a chart comparing the different theories of intelligence. Your chart isn't going to look like what I have in front of me. Mine's going to be kind of a diagram. You're actually going to have it on the back of your chart is going to be the same diagram. Okay. So it looks a little bit like this. So we're going to start in the top left-hand corner with Spearman. And so this is on the back of your chart. It's the back of your handout. So when we're talking about what are the arguments for and against intelligence as being a single thing, a single mental ability, or is it many different mental abilities? So we're going to start off with Charles Spearman. He lived from 1863 to 1955, and he's going to argue that there is a single factor for intelligence, so just one factor. So his theory is called general intelligence, and he shortens that to the G factor, G standing for general. So he will say that intelligence is really just one mental ability, and that one mental ability is linked to several different clusters of things, right? But he's still going to say that you have a basic intelligence, and that intelligence predicts your ability on a variety of things. The thing I would make sure that you circle, highlight with Spearman is that he's going to say there's one factor, the G factor is your intelligence. But for Spearman, intelligence focused on specifically academic areas, right? So this is still very much like a school smarts intelligence. So his G factor is still very much talking about academic areas. And in order to figure out what the G factor was, this is where you see factor analysis coming into play, right? So factor analysis is a statistical procedure that identifies clusters of related items. And this is what we talked about with Cattell and the personality unit under trait theory used factor analysis. But the same idea, like your book talked to you about people who do well on vocabulary items. So like on a vocab test, tend to do really well on paragraph comprehension, so understanding what you're reading. And it makes sense that in order to understand what you're reading or to comprehend it, you have to have a relatively high vocabulary, right? And all of those things are also part of what Spearman would call your verbal intelligence. So he's kind of saying that there's one underlying factor for your intelligence, and he's going to call that the G factor. Okay. So once again, he's going to say if you score well on, let's say, one type of intelligence like verbal intelligence, you also typically score well on spatial intelligence and reasoning. So he's going to say that there's really only one factor in intelligence. He's going to call that the G factor. Okay. The next person that we're going to talk about is L.L. Thurstone. Okay. I think it's Thurstone, not Thurston, but it's Thurstone. And Thurston is going to disagree with Spearman. So he's going to contradict Spearman. Okay. Thurston, and you need to know the number for each of these people in terms of what their factors are. Thurston is going to say that there's 7 different clusters of intelligence. So that it's not one single cluster that Spearman's going to say. It's 7 different clusters. And his clusters are listed there for you are going to be word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. Okay. And he's going to argue there's a relatively weak factor relating all of those. So he's not going to agree with this idea of a G factor, that one thing kind of underlines all of those different 7 categories. Okay. So that's going to be kind of his disagreement with Spearman, that it's really 7 different factors. It's not just one. Still, if you notice those factors, right, word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, all those there are still very much academically related, right? So those are still what I would call like the traditional intelligence testing components, right? So they're all very much related to school smarts, academics, intelligence. Okay. Then we're going to move to Gardner. Gardner is going to agree with Thurstone, right, saying that there are different types of intelligence. So Gardner's theory is going to be the theory of multiple intelligence. Specifically, he's going to say there's 8 different types of intelligence. And his are going to be slightly different from what Thurston comes up with. So you have linguistic, right? Linguistic is talking about like your oral expression, your written expression, your literacy. You have logical mathematical, so talking about your concrete reasoning, your abstract reasoning, determining causal relationships, complex operations. Musical ability, so patterning, audiation, which is like thinking musically rather than verbally. You have spatial reasoning. Spatial reasoning is talking about your spatial awareness, visual acuity, your imagination, a little bit of, small motor coordination. Bodily kinesthetic is talking about the movement of your body. Interpersonal is talking about your relationship in terms of yourself. Interpersonal is talking about your relationship and how you get along with other people. And naturalistic. He speculates there could be a 9th, which he calls existential intelligence, which is your ability to think about and the idea of questioning life and questioning death and its existence. So Gardner's going to have the theory of multiple intelligence. That's his theory name. It's the theory of multiple intelligence. And he's going to say there's 8, right? Which is going to agree with Spearman that it's not just 7, but there's 8. Okay. Then it takes us to Sternberg. Sternberg is going to say that 8 basically becomes too many, right? Like if you're going to have 8 intelligences and now you're proposing a 9th, are all of your abilities considered an intelligence? Should some of them that are going to be less vital just be considered talents? Like, where are you going to draw the line? Like, how many can we come up with in terms of different types of intelligence? Where are too many? So Gardner's going to say, like, there are multiple intelligences, but there's only going to be 3, right? So for Gardner, it factors down. He's going to say some of those that Gardner came up with, you can kind of see that they're related to each other. So Sternberg is going to say there's only 3 different types of intelligence. So everything comes down to these 3. So the first one is analytical intelligence, which is what you would assess with regular intelligence testing. So think of it as more like the school smarts. Creative intelligence, which is like your ability to adapt to novel situation. A novel situation is a new situation. Or generating novel ideas, so coming up with new ideas. And then you have practical intelligence, which would be required for everyday tasks. Think of it kind of like your street smarts. Okay. So those are the kind of overview of the 4 different theories. A couple of things to note, and I mentioned some of these before, but I'll repeat a couple of them and add some new things. When we're talking about Spearman with G factor, he's saying that those are typically academically related, like it's an academic intelligence. Thurston, you can also see, is still talking about academic, right? Word fluency, verbal comprehension, those are things tested in schools. When Gardner talks about his theory of multiple intelligence, this is finally the point where we start to talk about intelligence outside of a traditional classroom, right? So it's beyond the school smarts, right? There's the how well do you get along with each other, musical. There's a lot of different pieces there that are outside the traditional school. And when we talk about Sternberg, you have to kind of remember the 3. I remember it spells PAC, right? So practical, analytical, creative. That's how I remember Sternberg. And Sternberg is going to say that are 3 separate intelligences. But as we've studied those more, on some level, analytic and creative also can be related to practical. So the fact that on some level, could there be a factor that relates to 3 of them? If there is a factor that underlines all 3 of them, then wouldn't Spearman be right? And it would really, intelligence really is just a G factor. It's one kind of mental ability that underlines all the other ones, right? So you can see that this is kind of the controversy in terms of intelligence. How are these things related to each other? Is it one factor that underlines your intelligence? Are there several different categories? Okay. The one additional term that's not listed on your screen that I want to talk very quickly about is the idea of a savant syndrome. So savant syndrome is a condition in which a person who is otherwise limited in their mental ability has an exceptional, very specific skill. A lot of times people who have savant syndrome are on the autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum or have autism spectrum disorder. So you can think of someone who maybe in terms of most of their intelligences, if we're talking about linguistic, musical, spatial, interpersonal, etc., so think about Gardner's theories, is very low, but they have an extraordinary mathematical ability, right? So you can give them any math problem and they can compute it in their head in seconds, right? So if I said, they might struggle with emotionally reading other people, that would be the intrapersonal. They struggle with communicating with other people. But if I said, what's 5,286 times 2,874, and they would just give you the answer, right? So that would be like an extreme, very specific, that's exceptional skill. So that is considered a savant. 4 out of 5 savants are male. And once again, many of them are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Okay. So that's kind of our overview of the different theories of intelligence. And the very last thing I want to quickly talk about is the idea of emotional intelligence. Sometimes you hear emotional intelligence referred to as someone's EQ, like their emotional quotient, as opposed to their IQ, which is your intelligence quotient. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's your ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use your emotions. I know this might sound pretty basic for some of you, but some people genuinely struggle in terms of perceiving, understanding, managing, and using emotions. So when we're talking about perceiving emotion, we're talking about the ability to recognize emotion in other people's faces, recognizing emotion in music and stories. We're talking about understanding emotions. We're talking about being able to predict someone's emotions and how those emotions can change. Managing your emotions, which is to know how to express them in varied situations, like what's emotionally appropriate. What is emotionally appropriate for you to express to me versus for you to express to your parent or a friend. And your ability to use emotions in terms of your adapting to different environments and creating or creative problem solving, right? So that's kind of the general overview of emotional intelligence. And now we're done with this video, young adults. Good job.